April 1945. Bavaria, Germany. ****. The morning light filters through broken window panes, casting fractured patterns across the wooden floor of a farmhouse outside Munich. Dust particles hang suspended in the air, disturbed by the careful footsteps of uniformed men moving through rooms that still smell of yesterday's bread and the acrid residue of fear. Outside, the rumble of engines fades into the distance as convoy trucks roll westward, leaving behind a silence that feels heavier than the bombardments that preceded it. In the kitchen, 3 women stand with their backs pressed against the wall, a grandmother with silver hair pulled tight in a bun, her daughter whose hands tremble against her apron, and a young girl of perhaps 16 whose wide eyes track every movement of the foreign soldiers now occupying her home. They have been told stories. They have been warned. They have been prepared for monsters. But the man removing his helmet and setting it carefully on the table does not roar. He does not strike. He speaks in broken German, his accent strange but his voice low, almost apologetic, asking if anyone in the house needs medical attention. The grandmother's fingers dig into her daughter's arm. This is not what they expected. This is not what Goebbels promised. For 12 years, the women of Germany had been schooled in a mythology of enemies. The propaganda ministry had painted the Americans as brutish degenerates, cultural barbarians corrupted by jazz and racial mixing, soldiers without discipline who would bring chaos and violation to the Reich's doorstep. In 1,000 newsreels and radio broadcasts, in posters plastered on schoolhouse walls and factory bulletin boards, the message had been hammered home. The enemy was subhuman, savage, incapable of mercy. German women were instructed to flee or resist, to poison their children rather than let them fall into American hands, to expect nothing but the worst horrors humanity could inflict. Yet here, in this farmhouse kitchen with its cold stove and empty cupboards, the reality fracturing before these 3 women tells a different story entirely. The American captain asks again, this time in halting, textbook German that mangles the pronunciation but communicates concern. He gestures toward the chairs, inviting them to sit. When the young girl begins to cry, not from violence but from the sheer cognitive dissonance of the moment, he steps backward to give her space, his hands raised in a gesture of non-threat that speaks a universal language older than any nation's propaganda. This scene, repeated in 1,000 villages and towns across the collapsing Reich, represented one of history's strangest cultural collisions. It was not merely the meeting of victor and vanquished, conqueror and conquered. It was the moment when ideology met reality, when years of carefully constructed narrative ran headlong into the lived experience of encounter. 4 German women, trained to expect devils, the calm professionalism of American occupation forces became a revelation that would reshape not just their understanding of the enemy, but their understanding of everything they had been taught about the world. The German people had not entered the war innocent of militarism. The memory of the First World War's humiliation lingered in every beer hall and veterans association, in the Treaty of Versailles' punitive terms and the hyperinflation that had destroyed the savings of the middle class. When Hitler rose to power promising restoration of national pride, he found a population hungry for redemption, desperate to believe that Germany's defeat had been the result of betrayal rather than battlefield reality. The narrative was seductive. Germany had been stabbed in the back, undermined by internal enemies, cheated of victory by an international conspiracy. This time would be different. This time, the Reich would be uncompromising, total, victorious. Within this worldview, the enemy had to be diminished, dehumanized, made into something less than worthy opponents. If Germany was to be the pinnacle of civilization, disciplined, organized, racially pure, then its enemies must represent civilization's opposite. The propaganda machinery, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels with a showman's instinct for psychological manipulation, set about creating a portrait of America that emphasized every perceived weakness and degeneracy. American soldiers were depicted as criminals, released from prisons to swell the ranks. They were mongrels, the propaganda insisted, a chaotic mixture of races without the blood purity that gave the German soldier his strength. They were soft, raised on luxury and jazz music, incapable of the iron discipline required for true military effectiveness. They were cowards who relied on material superiority rather than martial spirit, who would crumble when faced with the hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. For German women, the propaganda took on especially dark overtones. The messaging was explicit. American occupation would bring sexual violence, cultural degradation, the destruction of German family life. Women were shown images of leering, bestial caricatures in American uniform. Radio broadcasts described imagined atrocities in graphic detail. The message was clear: death was preferable to falling into American hands. Some women believed it so thoroughly that they took their own lives and the lives of their children as Allied forces approached, choosing poison or drowning over the horrors they had been promised would come. But propaganda, no matter how sophisticated, cannot survive sustained contact with contradictory reality. And the reality that began unfolding in April 1945, as American forces swept through southern Germany, contradicted every carefully constructed myth the Nazi state had fed its people. The first encounters were tentative, charged with the electricity of mutual suspicion. American soldiers, many of them barely 20 years old, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Pittsburgh, approached German towns with loaded weapons and tactical caution. They had seen the newsreels from liberated concentration camps. They had lost friends to German bullets and shells. They had every reason to expect hostility, every reason to maintain defensive postures. Yet they had also been trained, extensively, repeatedly, on the rules of military conduct, on the Geneva Conventions, on the distinction between enemy soldiers and civilian populations. General Dwight Eisenhower had made it explicitly clear that the occupation was to be correct, professional, and oriented toward eventual reconstruction. Unlike the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces brought a retribution born of unimaginable suffering, the American advance came with military police, civil affairs units, and detailed protocols for civilian interaction. Soldiers who violated those protocols faced court-martial. Officers who failed to maintain discipline faced relief of command. The American military, for all its material abundance and sometimes chaotic energy, operated under a code of conduct that took the laws of war seriously. For German women, this created a moment of profound disorientation. The soldiers entering their towns did not immediately begin looting and burning. They established checkpoints and curfews, searched houses for weapons and Nazi officials, but did so with a procedural formality that was almost bureaucratic. When they requisitioned buildings for military use, they often left notes explaining what had been taken and promising eventual compensation. When they distributed food from their own supplies, they did so without the accompanying assault that propaganda had promised would come. Frida K., a schoolteacher from a village near Regensburg, recorded in her diary an encounter that captures the bewilderment of these first meetings. They came to the house at dawn. I had already sent my children to hide in the cellar with my neighbor. I remained upstairs, determined to protect my home or die trying. The officer who entered was young, perhaps 25, with red hair and freckles that made him look like a boy playing dress-up. He spoke no German at all, but he showed me a card with printed phrases. "Do you have weapons? Are there soldiers here? Do you need food?" I answered no, and yes, though I expected the last answer to be a trap. He left and returned an hour later with a box: tinned meat, coffee, chocolate, powdered milk. He set it on my table, tipped his helmet in what I suppose was meant as politeness, and left. I stood there for perhaps 20 minutes, staring at that box, unable to reconcile it with everything I had been taught to expect. This pattern repeated itself across Bavaria, across the Rhineland, across every region that came under American occupation. The expected horrors did not materialize. Instead, there was paperwork. There were ration cards and military scrip. There were orders posted in awkwardly translated German explaining curfews and movement restrictions. There were soldiers who chewed gum and called everyone ma'am, regardless of age or status, a democratic informality that seemed bizarre to women raised in a culture of rigid hierarchical address. Most striking of all, there was the absence of yelling. In a military culture where officers screamed orders and subordinates snapped to attention, where volume was equated with authority and gentleness with weakness, the calm, conversational tone of American military interaction seemed almost incomprehensible. German women, accustomed to Wehrmacht officers who barked commands and demanded instant obedience, found themselves addressed by American soldiers who asked questions, said, "Please" and "Thank you," and seemed genuinely to care about the answer when they inquired about civilian welfare. The contrast was sharpest in those moments when American and German military cultures intersected directly. When American officers took over local government buildings, they often retained German administrative staff, needing their knowledge of local systems and their ability to communicate with the civilian population. German secretaries and clerks, reporting to work in buildings now festooned with American flags, found themselves in a strange hybrid world where their new occupiers managed occupation with a casualness that bordered on incomprehensible. Margaret S., who worked as a secretary in the municipal offices of a mid-sized Bavarian town, later described the dissonance. "Our former mayor had been a party member, of course. They all were. He ruled the office like a tyrant. His voice could be heard through walls, berating staff for the smallest errors. When he issued an order, you jumped. When he entered a room, you stood. This was simply how authority functioned. Then the Americans came. The captain they assigned to oversee municipal affairs was a lawyer from New York in civilian life. He sat at the mayor's old desk, but everything about him was different. He never raised his voice. He asked my opinion on procedures, as if my thoughts mattered. When I made an error in translation, he laughed, not in mockery, but in genuine amusement at the confusion, and asked me to explain the correct meaning. I worked in that office for 3 weeks before I stopped flinching every time he approached my desk. It took me that long to understand he was not going to shout. This behavioral pattern was not accidental. It reflected deep cultural assumptions embedded in American democratic society and military training. The American officer corps, unlike its Wehrmacht counterpart, was largely drawn from citizen soldiers, men who had been civilians 2 or 3 years earlier and would return to civilian life once the war ended. They had not been raised in a military caste system or trained to view hierarchy as an expression of natural order. They came from a society where authority, even military authority, was theoretically answerable to democratic principles, where even the highest-ranking general was, in theory, a servant of civilian leadership and constitutional law. Moreover, American soldiers had been extensively trained in psychological warfare awareness. They knew they were representing not just a military force but an ideological system in direct competition with fascism. They had been briefed on the importance of demonstrating democratic values through their conduct, of showing German civilians that the propaganda they had been fed about American barbarism was false. This was not purely humanitarian. It was strategic. A pacified, cooperative German population would ease occupation and reconstruction. A population that viewed Americans as liberators rather than conquerors would be less likely to mount resistance or insurgency. But beyond strategy and training, there was something simpler at work: material abundance and its psychological effects. American soldiers were, by the standards of 1945 Europe, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. They ate 3 full meals a day from supplies that seemed limitless. They had cigarettes and chocolate, coffee and chewing gum, all in such plenty that they could casually distribute them to children and civilians without experiencing shortage themselves. This material security created a psychological buffer against the stresses of occupation. Soldiers who were not hungry, not cold, not desperate, were soldiers who could afford gentleness, who could follow rules even when those rules seemed militarily unnecessary. German women, observing this abundance, experienced a second revelation layered atop the first. It was not merely that Americans were calm rather than brutal. It was that they seemed to have come from a world of such plenty that brutality was unnecessary. The propaganda had claimed American material superiority meant nothing in the face of German discipline and will. But when confronted with the reality of that material superiority, the psychological impact was devastating to Nazi ideology. The American soldiers' K-rations alone represented more food security than many German civilians had seen in months. The tinned meat, the chocolate bars, the instant coffee, these were not luxuries hoarded by officers but standard issue for every enlisted man. German women watched American soldiers trade cigarettes for services, use chocolate as casual currency, throw away food that was still edible simply because they had more. The wastefulness was shocking, yes, but it spoke to a productive capacity that made Germany's wartime sacrifices seem futile in retrospect. Elizabeth M., a mother of 4 from Stuttgart, recorded her thoughts after receiving food aid from American relief workers. They gave us each a care package. Inside was more food than I had seen in one place since before the war. Canned ham, powdered eggs, sugar. Real sugar, not the beetroot substitute we had been using. Coffee that smelled like coffee, not the acorn mixture we had been drinking. My youngest daughter, who is 7, asked me if the Americans were magicians. How else could they have so much? I had no answer. I had believed what we were told, that Germany was fighting against inferior nations, that our struggle was to overcome the world's jealousy of our superiority. But if we were superior, why were we starving while they had so much they could give it away? The symbolic weight of food cannot be overstated in understanding this moment of ideological collapse. In Nazi ideology, scarcity was supposed to forge strength. The German people were told their suffering was noble, that rationing and sacrifice were building a harder, more resilient race. The enemy, soft and weak, would crumble when forced to endure real hardship. But here was the paradox confronting German civilians in the spring of 1945. The enemy had never experienced their hardship. The enemy came from a land of such plenty that their soldiers carried more food in their personal packs than entire German families saw in a week. And these well-fed, materially secure soldiers were winning, decisively, against the supposedly superior warriors hardened by sacrifice. The chocolate bar, then, became more than a treat for hungry children. It became proof of a different social order, one where abundance was not hoarded by elites but distributed broadly enough that even frontline soldiers could share it with strangers. The American willingness to give food away suggested a society so productive, so wealthy at the base level, that generosity was affordable. This was not the behavior of a desperate nation scraping together its last resources. This was a nation that could wage a two-ocean war, supply its allies through Lend-Lease, and still have enough surplus that its soldiers could casually hand out chocolate to enemy civilians. As April turned to May and Germany's surrender became inevitable, the initial encounters between American forces and German women evolved into something more complex. Not friendship, exactly, but a working relationship that defied the boundaries propaganda had insisted were absolute. German women who had expected to be enslaved found themselves employed by American military government offices, working as translators, cooks, laundresses, and clerks. They were paid in occupation scrip, given meals from military kitchens, and treated as employees rather than captives. This, too, contradicted everything they had been taught. In Nazi ideology, work was supposed to reflect racial hierarchy. Conquered peoples worked as slaves because they were inferior. But American military governance operated on different principles, pragmatic and quasi-contractual. Work was compensated. Employment was voluntary, at least in theory. German women who worked for American forces were not branded or beaten, not forced into sexual servitude or worked to death. They were given shifts and lunch breaks, paid on a schedule, and addressed with the same casual politeness American soldiers used with everyone. Hildegard B., who worked in the kitchen of an American military officer's mess, later reflected on the strangeness of this arrangement. I peeled potatoes alongside 2 other German women and an American corporal who supervised us. He could not have been more than 20. On his first day, he showed us how he wanted the potatoes cut, demonstrated the portion sizes, and then asked if we understood. Not ordered, asked. He worked alongside us, peeling his own potatoes while making conversation about his home in Wisconsin. He showed us photographs of his family's dairy farm, cows standing in green pastures that looked like paradise. When we broke for lunch, he ensured we ate the same food the American soldiers were eating, more food than I had seen in years. My hands shook holding the plate. I kept expecting someone to snatch it away, to tell me it was a mistake, that we would be beaten for presuming we could eat officers' rations. But no one came. We ate, and when we finished, the corporal asked if we wanted seconds. I thought I might weep. The experience of being treated not as racial inferiors but as human beings performing a job created a cognitive rupture that propaganda could not repair. For 12 years, Nazi ideology had insisted that hierarchies were natural, biological, permanent. Jews were subhuman. Slavs were inferior. The German Volk represented the pinnacle of racial evolution, and this superiority justified their domination over lesser peoples. But if Germans were racially superior, why were they serving food to their conquerors? And if Americans were racially inferior mongrels, why were they acting with a casual egalitarianism that treated German women as ordinary workers rather than conquered subjects? The American ideal of practical democracy, imperfectly realized in 1945, certainly, but present enough to be visible, clashed dramatically with everything German women had been taught about how power functioned. In their experience, power meant yelling, meant domination, meant rigid enforcement of hierarchy. A superior did not explain orders to an inferior. A victor did not ask the defeated for their opinion. An occupier did not care whether the occupied had enough to eat. Yet American forces did all these things, not out of special virtue necessarily, but because these behaviors were embedded in a culture that had, for all its flaws and contradictions, absorbed some baseline assumptions about human dignity that Nazi ideology explicitly rejected. The revelation was not universal, of course. Some German women never abandoned their Nazi convictions, viewing American kindness as weakness or as a trap designed to extract information. Some communities remained hostile, seeing collaboration with occupation forces as betrayal. The Hitler Youth had indoctrinated a generation of teenagers with fanaticism that could not be undone by chocolate bars and polite officers. And American forces were not uniformly virtuous. There were assaults, there were instances of theft and abuse, there were soldiers who treated Germans with contempt or cruelty. The reality of occupation was messy and contradictory, containing within it both genuine attempts at humane governance and the inevitable abuses that accompany military power. But for many German women, the cumulative weight of encounters gradually eroded the certainty of Nazi ideology. It was not any single moment but the aggregation of small experiences, an officer who said, "Please," a soldier who played with German children, a supply sergeant who ensured civilian workers received their full rations, a military policeman who investigated crimes against German victims with the same seriousness he would crimes against Americans. Each incident, taken alone, might be dismissed as an anomaly. But when the anomalies became the norm, when the expected horrors never materialized and were replaced instead by bureaucratic occupation and procedural correctness, the foundation of Nazi teachings began to crack. Anna Kay, a nurse who worked in a civilian hospital under American supervision, described the slow process of ideological collapse. It was not one thing. It was 1,000 small things. It was the American doctor who taught me a new surgical technique and called me colleague. It was the soldier who helped me carry supplies and refused payment. It was the officer who shut down the black market operation that was stealing from hospital stores, not because we complained. We were afraid to complain, but because one of his own men reported it and he took our word over his soldiers when we testified about what had been taken. Each time something like this happened, I felt the edifice I had been taught was truth shift slightly. I had believed Jews were subhuman. I had been taught this in school, had seen it reinforced in every newspaper and radio broadcast. But the American doctor who trained me was Jewish. I saw the dog tags around his neck, the little H for Hebrew stamped on them. He was the finest physician I had ever worked with, more skilled than our chief surgeon had been, more patient with his students, more dedicated to his patients. How could this man be subhuman? How could any of what I had been taught be true if this obvious contradiction stood before me every day, calmly explaining the principles of wound debridement in accented but competent German? These encounters forced a reckoning not just with Nazi ideology but with German self-conception. If the enemies they had fought were not subhuman barbarians but rather ordinary people from a different political system, if the soldiers now occupying their country were capable of kindness and professionalism, what did that mean about the war they had supported? What did it mean about the atrocities that were now coming to light as concentration camps were liberated and their full horror documented? If the Americans were not the monsters described in propaganda, what did that make the Germans who had committed actual monstrosity in the Reich's name? The physical evidence of American abundance continued to accumulate in ways that reinforced these uncomfortable questions. As summer arrived and occupation stabilized, German civilians witnessed the machinery of American logistics in full operation. Supply depots materialized with improbable speed, stocked with mountains of material that would have supplied the Wehrmacht for months. Trucks rolled in endless convoys, bringing fuel and ammunition, food and equipment, mail from home and recreational supplies for off-duty soldiers. The Americans built entire temporary cities, field hospitals and motor pools, airfields and command centers, with a speed that suggested resources so vast they could be casually expended. For German women who had spent the war years scraping by on ever-shrinking rations, who had collected acorns to make ersatz coffee and learned 100 ways to extend a single potato, the waste visible in American operations was simultaneously appalling and illuminating. They watched American soldiers throw away cigarettes half-smoked because they had entire cartons in their pockets. They saw food scraped from mess hall trays into waste barrels, food that could have fed families. They witnessed the casual destruction of equipment that broke down. Rather than repair a Jeep with a damaged transmission, American mechanics would sometimes strip it for parts and request a replacement, as if vehicles were as disposable as tissues. This wastefulness offended German frugality on one level, but on another level it demonstrated something that struck at the heart of Nazi ideology's claims. Germany had gone to war partly to secure Lebensraum, living space and resources for an expanding population. The justification was material scarcity. Germany needed territory to survive, needed to conquer and dominate to ensure its people's future. But here was America, a nation that had never experienced such scarcity, that produced so much it could afford to be wasteful, that had built an empire of abundance without needing to conquer Europe. What did this say about the necessity of the war? What did it say about the ideology that claimed war was necessary for survival? Krista W., who worked as a translator for American civil affairs officers, recorded a conversation that captured this realization. I was translating during a meeting between the American captain and our town council. The council was explaining how the war had destroyed the local mill, and without it, we could not process grain, which meant food shortage would worsen. They were asking for help, but expecting little. In our experience, requests for resources went to endless committees and were usually denied. The captain listened, made some notes, and then said he would have engineers look at the mill tomorrow and see what could be done. The council members looked at each other, uncertain if they had understood correctly. The next day, a team of American engineers arrived. By the end of the week, they had the mill operating again. They did not ask for payment. They did not demand concessions. They simply fixed it because it needed fixing and they had the resources to do so. After the engineers left, one of the council members said, "How did we think we could beat these people?" And no one had an answer. The question hung over Germany that summer like the dust from collapsed buildings. How had they thought they could win? The answer, of course, was that they had been lied to. They had been told Germany's enemies were weak, divided, degenerate. They had been told that willpower and racial superiority would overcome material disadvantage. They had been told that final victory was inevitable, right up until the moment Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe and the Reich collapsed into rubble. But it was more than just lies about military capability. The entire worldview Nazi ideology constructed was revealed as fundamentally false in the face of lived experience with American occupation. The claims about racial hierarchy collapsed when German women worked alongside African American soldiers and found them no different in essential humanity than anyone else, a profound cognitive shock in a society that had been taught racial segregation reflected natural law. The claims about democratic weakness collapsed when American forces demonstrated disciplined, professional military governance. The claims about cultural degeneracy collapsed when American soldiers revealed themselves to be ordinary young men who missed their families and wanted to go home, who carried photographs of sweethearts and talked about the farms and cities they would return to, who had dreams and fears that transcended national boundaries. The jazz music that had been denounced as degenerate noise became, for some young Germans, a symbol of a freer world. The informal manners that had been mocked as lack of discipline became, for some, evidence of a society confident enough in its principles that it did not need constant military rigidity. The American smile, that ubiquitous, often automatic American friendliness that Germans found baffling at first, came to represent something deeper than mere politeness. It suggested a society where people could afford to be friendly, where social interaction was not automatically hierarchical, where a person's worth was not determined entirely by their position in a chain of command. Not every German woman experienced this revelation, and not every revelation led to transformation. Ideology has deep roots, and 12 years of Nazi rule had shaped an entire generation's understanding of the world. Some women remained bitter, viewing their own people's suffering as more significant than the suffering Germans had inflicted on others. Some clung to conspiracy theories, insisting Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. Some simply tried to survive day to day without thinking too deeply about meaning or ideology, focused on finding food for their children and rebuilding homes from rubble. But enough women experienced enough cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality that something fundamental shifted in German society. The Americans did not yell. They did not rampage. They distributed food and repaired infrastructure. They were not perfect. Occupation is never perfect, and there were failures and abuses. But they were not the monsters propaganda had promised, and that gap between promise and reality created space for a reckoning. In the military government offices of occupied Germany, American civil affairs officers compiled reports on civilian attitudes, trying to gauge the population's mood and predict potential resistance. These reports, filed in bureaucratic language and stamped with security classifications, documented the surprise German civilians expressed at American conduct. One officer, a former professor from Pennsylvania, wrote, "The population expected atrocities based on propaganda they had been fed throughout the war. The absence of expected violence has created a state of confusion that may be exploitable for re-education purposes." Civilians repeatedly express shock that American soldiers are normal people. This suggests the propaganda was believed at a deep level. The contrast between expectation and experience appears to be undermining belief in other aspects of Nazi ideology. That final sentence proved prescient. The gap between what German women had been told about Americans and what they experienced did not exist in isolation. It called into question everything else they had been told. If the regime had lied about the enemy's nature, What else had it lied about? If American soldiers were not subhuman degenerates, were the people the regime had murdered in concentration camps also not what they claimed? If American democracy produced such material abundance and such disciplined military force, was it really as weak and corrupt as they had been taught? These questions were dangerous to ask aloud in the summer of 1945. Germany was in chaos, its population displaced and traumatized, its cities in ruins, its future uncertain. American forces maintained order through military authority, not through German consensus. But in private diaries, in whispered conversations, in the gradual shift of perspective that comes from accumulated experience rather than single epiphanies, German women began to reshape their understanding of what had happened and why. The chocolate bar became a symbol that recurred in these private reckonings. It appeared in diaries and letters, in memories recorded decades later, as the small object that represented something larger. The American soldier who gave chocolate to German children was not just being kind. He was demonstrating that his society produced such abundance that he could afford generosity. The chocolate was American industrial capacity made tangible and sweet. It was proof that the United States had fought a two-front war across two oceans while still feeding its own people well enough that soldiers could carry candy in their pockets. It was evidence of a system that worked differently than the Reich, that produced different results, that maybe, this was the dangerous thought, worked better. Decades later, historians would analyze the success of American occupation and the Federal Republic's emergence as a stable democracy, searching for explanations in policy papers and diplomatic negotiations. But for the women who lived through those first encounters in April and May of 1945, the explanation was simpler and more human. They had expected monsters and met young men who said, "Please," and handed out chocolate. They had expected brutality and found bureaucracy. They had expected to lose everything and instead found their mills repaired and hospitals restocked. The gap between expectation and experience created space for transformation. Berlin, 1946. In a classroom in the American sector, a re-education program is underway. German women sit at desks, listening to an American lecturer explain the principles of democratic governance. Some are attentive. Some are skeptical. Some are simply there because the program provides a meal. The lecturer, a woman from Chicago who speaks excellent German, is describing the concept of civil rights, the idea that individuals possess inherent dignity regardless of race or status. In the back row, a woman in her 30s takes notes. She is a former schoolteacher, trained under the Nazi system to instruct children in racial ideology. She had taught students to categorize human beings into hierarchies of worth. She had led her class in songs praising the Führer. She had believed, truly believed, that she was serving a great cause. Then American soldiers had arrived in her town. They had not shot her, though she had taught children to hate them. They had requisitioned her school but left the library intact. They had hired her to teach again, but with new books, new curriculum, new ideas. The officer who interviewed her for the position had asked about her Nazi Party membership. She had joined, as all teachers were required to, and then had asked if she understood why the ideology she had taught was harmful. She had not known how to answer. He had not yelled. He had simply given her books to read and told her to think about it. Now, in this classroom, listening to an American woman explain principles of human dignity, she thinks about the officer who never raised his voice. She thinks about the soldiers who repaired her school's roof without being asked. She thinks about the food packages distributed to students, ensuring children could learn without hunger distracting them. She thinks about every small interaction that contradicted what she had been taught about the enemy. The lecturer is saying something about democracy requiring faith in human capacity for reason and self-governance. The former Nazi teacher writes this down, underlining it twice. She does not yet fully understand what is happening inside her mind, the slow collapse of certainty and the painful emergence of doubt, the beginning of a transformation that will take years to complete. But she knows something has changed. She knows that when she returns to teaching, she cannot teach what she taught before. The Americans did not yell. They did not need to. Their calm insistence that she had been wrong carried more force than any shout could have. The poet Rilke once wrote that transformation is not a sudden light but a slow wind that changes the shape of dunes grain by grain. For German women in 1945, transformation came not in a moment of dramatic revelation but in the accumulation of small contradictions between ideology and experience. Each encounter with an American soldier who defied propaganda's promises moved one grain of sand. Each meal provided, each mill repaired, each patient conversation when they expected violence shifted the landscape imperceptibly. Over time, those accumulated grains became new formations. A society that had embraced totalitarianism began to consider democracy. A population taught to believe in racial hierarchy began to grapple with equality. Women who had expected to be conquered found themselves participants in reconstruction. None of this was perfect or complete. Germany remained divided, scarred, haunted by its crimes. American occupation had its own hypocrisies and failures. But the foundation had been disturbed, and on disturbed ground, new things can grow. The American soldier distributing chocolate in April 1945 did not set out to transform German ideology. He was following orders, being decent because his culture and training told him that was how you behaved, sharing from his abundance because he could afford to and it cost him nothing. But in that small transaction, candy given to a hungry child, a mother's expectations shattered, a moment of human connection across the chasm of war, lay the seed of something larger. History is made of such moments, quiet exchanges that accumulate into movements, individual experiences that aggregate into social transformation. The Americans did not yell. In not yelling, in being calm and professional and human, they demonstrated that authority could function without brutality, that power could coexist with decency, that victory did not require domination. For women who had known only totalitarian certainty, this demonstration of democratic possibility was revolutionary. The war ended not with Germany's transformation but with its defeat. But defeat created the conditions for transformation, and American occupation, for all its flaws, provided examples that propaganda could not overcome. The calm voice that asked instead of demanded. The chocolate bar that spoke of abundance. The repaired mill that demonstrated generosity. The soldier who did not yell. These were the small things that moved the grains of sand, that changed the shape of the dunes, that made possible the long, difficult journey from totalitarianism toward something freer, something more human, something that recognized the dignity even former enemies possess. The Americans did not yell. And in their restraint, their professionalism, their casual distribution of abundance, they offered proof that another world was possible, a world where power did not require cruelty, where order did not demand brutality, where victory could be humane. That world was not perfect. It was never perfect. But for women who had expected monsters and found young men who said, "Please," and shared their chocolate, it was different enough to matter. Different enough to plant doubt. Different enough to begin the long transformation from certainty to questioning, from ideology to humility, from the 1,000-year Reichsrubble toward a future none of them had imagined possible. The chocolate bar, melting in a child's hand on a spring morning in Bavaria. The calm voice, asking in broken German if anyone needed help. The repaired mill, grinding again because someone thought it should. These are not the grand moments history celebrates. But they are the moments history is built from, grain by grain, conversation by conversation, the slow wind of human decency moving across the landscape of ideology until nothing remains the same. They don't yell, the German women whispered to each other in those first days of occupation, surprised and uncertain. They don't yell. And in that absence of yelling, in that gap between expectation and reality, A nation began the long work of understanding what it had done, what had been done to it, and what might yet be possible if people could learn to see each other not as propaganda defined them, but as they actually were, flawed, human, capable of both terrible cruelty and unexpected kindness. The Americans who occupied Germany in 1945 were not saints. They were ordinary people, products of their own imperfect society, carrying their own prejudices and limitations. But they came from a system that, for all its contradictions, had absorbed some basic democratic principles deeply enough that even its soldiers embodied them. They came with abundance that made generosity possible. They came with training that emphasized laws over vengeance. They came, and they did not yell. History would remember the grand strategies, the diplomatic negotiations, the Marshall Plan, and the Berlin airlift. But in the farmhouses and municipal offices, in the kitchens and hospitals where German women encountered American occupation in its daily reality, history was being made in quieter ways. A question asked instead of an order barked. A meal shared. A dignity preserved. Grain by grain, the landscape shifted, and in that shifting lay the foundation for everything that would follow: the Federal Republic's emergence, the economic miracle, the long reckoning with Nazi crimes, the transformation of Germany from totalitarian aggressor to democratic partner. It began with chocolate and calm voices. It began with the Americans who did not yell. And in that beginning, despite all the horror that preceded it and all the difficulty that would follow, lay a small, fragile seed of hope that even the deepest certainties can be questioned, even the strongest ideologies can crumble, and even enemies can become, given time and patience and the slow accumulation of contradictory evidence, something approaching human to each other once more.